My parents told me to leave after I confessed I didn't want kids. Later, my sister whispered, "They always loved you more," as she stormed out of the baby shower crying. My sister Selena and I were standing near the garden path at her baby shower, the pink and white balloons bobbing behind us like silent witnesses to the tension simmering between us. Her voice was shaky but sharp. "You don't care what anyone thinks. You just do whatever you want. And they still love you more." She turned before I could respond, her hand instinctively cradling her pregnant belly as she stormed off toward the crowd of pastel dresses and laughter that didn't match the atmosphere between us. It's taken me weeks to even process what happened, why I was told to leave a family event to be honest, and why Selena, who was finally getting everything she always wanted, looked at me like I was the one who had taken something from her. I'm Maura. I'm 38, single, and child-free by choice. I live in Boston, where I work in coastal conservation. My life is busy but fulfilling, full of travel, community work, and long walks by the harbor when the tourists thin out. I've never wanted children, not even as a kid playing house. I like being the aunt who sends weird science kits and text memes at 2 a.m. That role fits me. It always has. I come from a small town just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, where my parents still live in the same house we grew up in. My younger sister Selena, now 34, lives about an hour from them with her husband Terrence. They've been married for 10 years and have recently gotten pregnant with their first child. It's a girl, due in a couple of months. Growing up, Selena and I were not close in the traditional sense. We weren't enemies, there was no screaming or hair pulling or diary reading. But we operated in entirely different lanes. I was quiet, buried in books or obsessed with whatever animal documentary had just aired. Selena was all glitter, gossip, and dance routines in the driveway with her friends. My parents used to say, "You two balance each other out," which I think was their nice way of acknowledging we had nothing in common. They loved us both, but differently. I was the easy one, low maintenance, straight A's, always home before curfew. Selena needed more attention, reassurance, hands-on help with everything from homework to friendships. Our mom used to rub her back when she cried and make her hot cocoa with those tiny marshmallows she liked. I, on the other hand, mostly solved my own problems before they could notice. As we got older, that dynamic stuck. Selena stayed local, went to community college, met Terrence at a 4th of July barbecue, and settled into a life my parents found relatable and admirable. I moved out of state for college, then grad school, then work. I started making choices that didn't revolve around a nuclear family blueprint, and though they smiled and nodded, I could always feel the undercurrent of quiet disapproval. That undercurrent turned into something else entirely last Thanksgiving. We were all back at the house in Charlottesville. Selena had just announced her pregnancy a week earlier via a group text with an ultrasound pic and a baby emoji captioned "coming soon." At the dinner table, the conversation was all baby talk, nurseries, cravings, names. I was genuinely happy for her, but it felt like everyone was orbiting around her belly like it was the sun. Then Aunt Geraldine piped up with her usual bluntness and asked, "So, Maura, when are you going to give your mother a reason to crochet something?" I smiled and said, "Oh, I'm not planning to have kids. That's never really been something I wanted." There was a beat of silence. Not a shock, really. Just adjustment. Like everyone at the table had to shift the script they had pre-written in their heads for me. My mother blinked and put down her fork. "You've always been so good with children." "I like kids," I said. "I just don't want any of my own." Selena laughed quietly and said, "Yeah, Maura's way too busy saving the world for diapers." It was meant as a joke, I think, but it landed sideways. My father looked over at me and said, "It's not too late, you know." "I know," I said, keeping my voice even. Mom folded her napkin very precisely and said, "I just hope you don't end up alone." That was the moment I knew, whatever they thought of my life, it was always going to be second best in their eyes. Fast forward to last month. I flew back for Selena's baby shower. It was being held at Meadowlark Botanical Gardens in Vienna, Virginia, beautiful venue, sunny day, everything trimmed in florals and pale pink. I wasn't planning on making a big splash. I brought a handmade baby blanket I found from a local artisan in Boston. I even wore a dress instead of my usual jeans. The first hour went fine. There were cupcakes and baby-themed games. A few of Selena's old friends were there, most of whom I hadn't seen since high school. One of them, I think her name was Kara or maybe Mallory, asked if I was going to be next. I replied the same way I always do. Calm, polite, actually, I don't plan on having kids. Selena chimed in again, half joking, Mora's more the cool aunt type. She's allergic to settling down. I smiled, but it felt sharp this time. Then my mom, who had been nearby, stepped in. I thought you were just waiting for the right time. Or a person. I'm not, I said, still calm. I've made peace with that. It's a choice. She looked hurt. But it's not natural, Mora. There were murmurs around us now. I felt heat rise in my chest. You've said that before, my dad added from behind her. But we raised you to understand the importance of family. I do understand it. That's why I'm here, even though I knew this would come up. It was subtle, but I saw Mom's hand tighten around her iced tea glass. Then maybe, she said, if you don't believe in family the way we do, you shouldn't be here today. There it was. Not a scream. Not a tantrum. Just a cold cut. Selena didn't say anything. She looked down at her baby bump like it held the answer to a question none of us could ask out loud. So, I left. I walked out of that perfect venue, past the swan pond and the rose arbor, feeling a kind of grief I couldn't name yet. I didn't get far. I was near the parking lot when I heard my name called. Selena caught up to me, breathless and teary. You always get to walk away, she said, voice shaking. What are you talking about? You live your life however you want. You don't care what anyone thinks. You didn't need them. And still. They look at you like you're some kind of hero. I gave them what they wanted, and I still feel like the backup plan. I didn't ask for any of that. I know, she whispered. But you got it anyway. Then she looked down at her belly and back at me. And I'm terrified I'm about to bring someone into this world who'll grow up feeling like I did. I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. She turned and walked back, shoulders shaking as she disappeared behind the hedges. I didn't go back inside. I sat in my rental car for almost half an hour, watching the shadows shift across the pavement as the sun tilted down. I kept hearing her voice in my head, you got it anyway. That phrase lingered in a way nothing else did. Not Mom's disapproval. Not Dad's quiet disappointment. Just that, you got it anyway. It rattled me. Because I hadn't gotten anything, at least not on purpose. I hadn't asked for anyone's pride or preference or even understanding. I'd carved out my own space in life because it felt like the only way to breathe. I didn't know that Selena felt like she was living in my shadow. I thought she had everything she wanted. A partner who adored her. A home. A child on the way. A clear role in the family, one that made sense and got celebrated. I drove back to the hotel I'd booked near Tyson's Corner. I had planned to stay for a few days, help Selena set up the nursery, maybe even take her out for lunch or get a pedicure together. But that evening, I canceled everything and changed my flight to leave early the next morning. The hotel room was sterile and too cold, and I couldn't bring myself to eat the takeout I'd ordered. I just sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through photos on my phone of things that once felt like home but now felt like a set I'd stepped off for too long to be let back on. My parents didn't call. Neither did Selena. For 3 weeks, nothing. Radio silence. And I didn't reach out either. Part of me was stubborn, thinking, if they really want to understand me, they can call. The other part was just tired. Exhausted by the quiet war that had existed for decades beneath all the surface smiles and holiday cards. I needed to sit with it. To figure out what exactly I was grieving for. It wasn't just the fight. It was the realization that no matter how old you get, family has a way of dragging you back to your most insecure, unfinished self. I was 38 and independent, yet all it took was one afternoon back in Virginia for me to feel like the 12-year-old who was too serious, too cold, too different. Then, out of nowhere, I got a letter. An actual, handwritten letter, postmarked from Charlottesville. It was from Dad. The handwriting was a bit shaky, like he'd taken his time, pressing too hard with a black ballpoint pen. There were only a few paragraphs, written on one of those yellow legal pads he always kept in the kitchen drawer. He wrote that he was sorry. That they had reacted poorly. That they had trouble understanding my choices, but that didn't mean they didn't respect them. He said my mom was hurt that I had never really explained why I didn't want children, not to change my mind, but because she wanted to understand. He said they had always assumed I'd grow into the idea the way they had, and when that didn't happen, it scared them. I know we made you feel unwelcome, he wrote. That wasn't right. We were wrong. I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry. But something softened. Something in my chest that had been clamped shut for weeks, maybe years, loosened. I still didn't call. But a few days later, I got a text from Selena. No words. Just a picture. Her baby, Mira, had been born a week early. She was swaddled in the handwoven blanket I had given her at the shower, her tiny fists tucked under her chin, her face scrunched in that impossibly new way that only babies manage. I stared at that photo until my phone screen dimmed. Then I sat down and wrote back a single line. She's beautiful. No reply came. Not that night. Not the next day. But it was something. A flicker. A crack in the silence. Over the next couple of weeks, we exchanged a few short texts. Photos. Small updates. Selena didn't apologize. Neither did I. But we were circling back into each other's orbit, slowly and without ceremony. And maybe that's the only way it could have happened. Not through big speeches or tearful calls, but through the quiet, deliberate choice to try again. I flew down once, when Mira was about 3 months old. It wasn't a formal visit. Selena invited me herself. I brought books, baby ones and some for her, and we sat in the backyard where we used to play, watching the baby nap on a travel bassinet while sipping lukewarm coffee under the shade of the maple tree. Selena looked tired. But in that seasoned, lived-in way. The kind of tiredness that comes with purpose, not regret. We talked about the baby. About Terrence's new schedule. About a neighbor's dog that kept getting into their trash. Nothing deep. Nothing sharp. At one point, she looked at me and said, "Do you ever feel like you ended up exactly where you're supposed to be?" It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't pointed. It was just a question. And I nodded. I do. She stared at Mira for a moment and whispered, "Me too." That was all. We didn't talk about the shower. We didn't revisit what was said or unsaid. But something changed that afternoon. A mutual understanding had settled into the space between us. She didn't want my life, and I didn't want hers. But we could still be in each other's lives. Still, my parents, well, that's been slower. They're cordial. Occasionally reaching out. Asking about work. Sending birthday cards. But the conversations feel like walking on stones in a river, you're always thinking about your next step. About the slipperiness beneath you. About not falling in. They don't bring up grandchildren anymore. Or timelines. Or settling down. Maybe they finally accepted it. Or maybe they're just too tired to fight. But I've stopped trying to win their approval. And that, more than anything, feels like the biggest shift of all. I started noticing the quiet, unremarkable ways things were shifting. It was in the way my mother signed her last card, "Love you always," without the usual passive-aggressive note about how the house is quiet without little feet. It was how Dad mentioned a new book he'd read, something I'd recommended years ago, and how he seemed to want to talk about it, not just as a way to bond, but maybe to understand a little more of me. Selena and I didn't suddenly become best friends, but we were gentler with each other. Less reactive. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no heart-to-heart over wine and tears. Just a quiet reintroduction of ourselves to each other, like meeting again for the first time after a long trip apart. She sends me videos sometimes, Mira trying to roll over, Mira giggling in her high chair, Mira wearing an oversized beanie and looking bewildered by snow. I didn't know how to respond at first. I wasn't the gushing aunt type, and I worried anything I said would sound flat or forced. But Selena never expected over-the-top reactions. She sent them because they were her life now, and this was her way of including me. I began replying with little things of my own, pictures of the beach near my apartment, snapshots of the seabirds I monitored, articles I thought she might find funny. She didn't always respond, but she always saw them. And when she did reply, it was with something warm, sometimes nostalgic. A memory from our childhood. A shared smile from the past. We weren't fixing anything. We were simply being. The next time I visited, it wasn't a formal occasion. No holidays. No baby shower. Just a quiet weekend. I bought groceries and cooked dinner one night, something our mother used to make when we were kids, chicken pot pie with puff pastry that I always thought was too greasy, but Selena loved. She laughed when I set the pan on the table. "I can't believe you remembered," she said, eyes bright. "You're hard to forget," I replied. It wasn't a joke. It was the truth. That weekend, after Mira had gone to bed and Terrence was catching up on a game in the living room, we sat on her porch. It was warm for late March. The kind of evening that holds spring in its throat. Selena took a long sip from her tea and said, "I didn't mean what I said. At the baby shower. About them loving you more." I looked at her, surprised. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I never expected her to circle back to it. She didn't wait for me to respond. "I was scared," she said. "I felt like I'd done everything right and it still didn't feel enough. And then you were there, calm and certain, and I felt like everything I'd built was paper thin." I let her words settle between us. They weren't bitter this time. Just tired. "I don't think they loved either of us more," I said carefully. "I think they just didn't know how to love us the same way. Or the right way." She nodded slowly, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch light. "I just don't want Mira to feel like she's living someone else's plan. I don't want to push her towards something because it looks like what I wanted." "That's the best start you can give her," I said. "Let her know that she can want something different." It was quiet again after that. But not uncomfortable. I drove back to my hotel that night with the windows cracked, the spring air curling into the car, and I felt something that had eluded me for years, calm. For a long time, I had thought the problem was that they didn't accept me. That they couldn't understand my life or why I'd chosen it. But maybe it wasn't the understanding I needed. Maybe it was just space. Space to be myself. Space to not justify it. Space to exist alongside their values without constantly defending my own. Selena and I talked more frequently after that visit. Not every day, not even every week. But the connection stayed warm, like a light left on in another room. Sometimes we talked about motherhood, what it really meant, not just the aesthetics of it. Other times, we didn't talk about it at all. We'd discuss TV shows or new recipes or that one neighbor of hers who always mowed the lawn at 7 a.m. on Saturdays. My parents remained a more complicated story. Dad seemed to try more, in his own way. He sent articles about climate policy and occasionally texted to ask about work. Mom, though. She was slower. Warier. I think she still clung to the version of me she'd crafted in her mind, the version that might one day change her mind. The one who'd realize the clock was ticking and suddenly rush to fulfill the life she thought I was meant to live. But that clock never ticked for me. It never even started. And I stopped trying to wind it for their sake. Then one Sunday morning, a text came through from Mom. No good morning, no preamble. Just, Do you think if you had a daughter, you'd raise her differently than how we raised you? I stared at the screen for a long time. Eventually, I typed back, yes. But that doesn't mean you failed. No response. Not for days. Then came a card in the mail, in her usual flowery cursive, I'm still learning how to be your mom, even now. It wasn't everything. But it was something. And for the first time in a long while, I believed her. After that card, things didn't transform overnight. It wasn't like my mother suddenly became the champion of my lifestyle, nor did we magically start speaking the same emotional language. But something shifted, a small, almost imperceptible realignment. Our interaction stopped feeling like negotiations. The tension that once hung like humidity in the air around every visit began to lift, bit by bit. We started emailing, strangely enough. Not texting. Not calling. Emails. I think it gave her the space to think before speaking, and me the space to digest before reacting. It began with casual things. She sent me a recipe for lemon bars she used to make when we were kids. I replied with pictures of a local farmer's market and a story about a woman there who sold handmade aprons and wouldn't stop talking about how radishes were the unsung heroes of spring vegetables. A few weeks later, she sent a long message. Not an apology exactly, but a kind of reflection. She wrote about how, when she was my age, she didn't know who she was without her role as a mother. She said she'd always imagined I'd follow a similar path, not because she thought it was the only way to live, but because it was the only way she understood. I didn't know how to see a life as full if it didn't have the shape mine had, she wrote. But that was never your burden to carry. That line hit me hard. In a strange way, her words felt more like a confession than anything else. It wasn't approved, and it didn't need to be. It was the first time she'd admitted that her expectations had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her own fears. Around the same time, Selena and I had our first phone call in a while that wasn't about Mira or logistics. She'd just put the baby down for a nap and was folding laundry while we chatted. Her voice was a little lighter than usual, maybe because Mira had just started sleeping through the night. I was thinking, she said, about how different things would have been if we'd switched places. What do you mean? I asked. If you'd stayed here and I'd moved away, she said. If you were the one with a house 2 blocks from mom and dad, with the diaper pail in the corner and formula stains on your shirt. And I was up in Boston, sipping lattes and saving coral reefs. I smiled. I don't sip lattes. I chug cold brew like it's fuel. She laughed. Fair enough. She paused, then added, I think I would have drowned. It took me a second to realize she wasn't being dramatic. You're where you're supposed to be, Sel, I said softly. Yeah, she said. And so are you. We didn't need to say more after that. In the months that followed, our relationship found a rhythm. Not a daily, overly involved kind of closeness, but an honest one. We talked when we needed to. Shared things when we felt like it. And we started including each other in the small ways that matter, the offhand comments, the book recommendations, the photos of meals or weather or a new haircut. The kind of casual intimacy that builds a bridge between lives moving in different directions. When Mira turned 6 months old, I sent a box of books. Not the fluffy, bright-colored board books, but slightly odd, charming stories. One of them was The Paper Bag Princess, which Selena and I had both loved as kids. I included a note for Mira, short, silly, about dragons and dirt and being your own hero. Selena texted me later that night, she loved it. Or at least she drooled on it the most. That became our inside joke, book reviews based on drool levels. It still wasn't easy with my parents. There were times when old habits crept back in, when my mother would still drop hints about how my window was narrowing or ask whether I'd met anyone interesting lately with a hopeful lilt. I didn't get angry anymore. I just gently reminded her that I was happy, and that my life wasn't a waiting room. Dad, to his credit, was slower but steadier. He'd forward obscure environmental articles with subject lines like thought of you or cool fish stuff. Sometimes he'd call and ask technical questions he clearly didn't understand, just to let me talk. I think it was his way of listening. The real test came that Thanksgiving. The first holiday I agreed to attend since the baby shower. Selena offered to host at her place, partly to give Mira a familiar space and partly, I suspected, to shield me a little. The day before the dinner, she texted, "We'll keep it mellow. No pressure. Just food, baby giggles, and wine." She wasn't kidding. Dinner was low-key. Mira was in a high chair, gleefully smearing mashed sweet potato everywhere while Terrence tried to keep a bib on her. The turkey came out a little dry. The green beans were still crunchy. But no one cared. At some point, while helping clear dishes, my mother turned to me in the kitchen. "I can't believe you used to be so quiet," she said. I glanced over. "I'm still quiet." "No," she said, a little wistfully. "You're steady. There's a difference." It was one of those comments that doesn't ask for a reply. One that feels like it's been waiting a long time to be said. Later, after dessert, I was sitting on the floor with Mira in my lap, watching her gnaw on a wooden spoon like it held all the secrets of the universe. Selena was beside me, barefoot, her hair in a messy bun, eyes tired but soft. She leaned her head briefly on my shoulder. "I'm glad you came." "Me too," I said. And I meant it. Over the next year, life settled into something unremarkably real. Selena and I kept in touch regularly, sending each other photos, messages, and short calls that always seemed to end with Mira babbling nonsense into the phone. My parents, surprisingly, found a way to evolve, even if it was on their own slow terms. Dad had started joining a book club at the local library, something he probably never would have done without our email chain pushing him into it, and Mom had taken up quilting, which she'd once sworn she didn't have the patience for. But even in the gentleness of all that change, there was still an edge. A memory that didn't dull so easily. The baby shower. Being asked to lead by my own parents. Being made to feel like my life was some kind of embarrassment to be politely swept out of sight. That didn't go away. And as Thanksgiving came and went, followed by Myra's first birthday, an event I attended with a small handmade wooden stacking toy and a card that read, "For the little builder of her own future," I found myself quietly reflecting on that wound. It wasn't bitter. It was clear. The kind that comes not from rage, but from finally knowing where you stand. And I knew I'd never forget the way they looked at me that day in the garden, like I had failed them by living fully on my own terms. That's when the idea came, not vengeance, not spite, but a kind of reckoning. It started with an email. Subject: Legacy Planning for Independent Women. I had been working for months on a campaign with a nonprofit focused on sustainable communities. We had launched an initiative encouraging women to think about legacy, not just in terms of children, but through mentorships, land preservation, education funds, art, and environmental impact. I had given several interviews for it, most low profile. But one was picked up by The Atlantic for a piece titled "The Child-Free Life, a Different Kind of Legacy." They used my full name. I didn't send the article to my parents. I didn't need to. 3 days later, I got a text from my mom. "I read the article. I didn't realize you'd become, well, such a voice. I'm proud of you. I don't understand everything, but I see how many people you've helped." And from Dad, "Your mom's been passing that article around like it's a college diploma. I think the mailman knows now." It made me laugh, but it also grounded me. Because for years, their approval had felt conditional. Tied to milestones I never intended to reach. But now they were confronted with something undeniable: my value didn't need their validation. It existed outside of their plans for me. It was public, documented, and visible. That was the satisfying part. Not the fame. Not the recognition. But the reversal of power. I hadn't begged to be seen. I just lived fully, and they had to catch up. The real, quiet revenge was that my life, the one they once treated as incomplete, had become something they had to respect in front of others. They now bragged about the daughter they once pitied. My mother sent the article to her quilting group. Dad printed it out and took it to his book club. I went back home for a family dinner shortly after that. Same house. Same kitchen. Same too warm living room with the clock that still ticked too loudly. After we ate, Selena found me out on the back porch, the same one where we'd once sat in brittle silence. She handed me a mug of tea and said, "They won't shut up about you now." I laughed. I noticed. Mom said you're going to be the reason someone's going to grad school in Kenya. She's not wrong, I said. We're funding a scholarship. She looked at me for a moment. Then nodded, smiling faintly. You have your own legacy, she said. And you didn't have to change a thing. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That night, before I left, Mom hugged me a little longer than usual. Her eyes were glassy, but not tearful. I was wrong to push so hard, she whispered. I know, I said gently. But you stopped. We stood there for a moment, in the glow of the porch light, and I could feel it, what real peace felt like. Not forced. Not fragile. But earned. In the end, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about living in such a way that they had no choice but to finally see it for themselves. And that, I realized, was the best kind of revenge. Satisfying. Whole. And entirely on my terms.